Joining us now to discuss key takeaways from yesterday's White House meeting on the Ukraine war is Mike Leon, NTD News contributor and host of Can We Please Talk podcast. And also Tony Kinnett, national correspondent with the Daily Signal and host of the Tony Kinnett Cast radio show and podcast. So good to see you both. Again, it's been a while. Hope everyone is doing well. Tony, I'll start with you. What was the most consequential development, in your view, from yesterday's meeting?
I think the most consequential development, and by the way, good to see both of you guys again. It has been a while. The most consequential development, bar none, is that Trump was able to walk away from the meeting with the European leaders, reach out to Putin, and eventually get some kind, at least according to reporting from the Financial Times and the German Foreign Ministry, possible Zelensky and Putin sit down. That's the first time that's happened since well before the war began. And again, this kind of movement is occurring now. Again, with the economic leverage that Trump is bringing to bear, not just in possible sanctions or tariffs, but in $300 billion worth of frozen Russian assets. This is actually getting Putin a little bit closer to the table. His offensive lines have stalled. They're still slinging drones and artillery, and just at a single oil refinery district. So at least at this point, it appears that if Trump has been able to craft momentum with European leaders, not to mention the asset purchase agreements by Ukraine, this could be one of the biggest peace deals that we've seen in decades.
Okay, Mike, what are your impressions from yesterday's events leading up to today?
Yeah, good to see everybody, as was echoed by both of you. Yeah, I'll piggyback a little bit on what Tony said there, because I heard it just as I was coming on here from the Associated Press that interviewed Emmanuel Macron and the German Chancellor afterwards as well, and Starmer as well, the Prime Minister in UK. And they mentioned about exactly what Tony said, which is this bilateral talks between Putin and Zelensky. The two of them, I don't believe, if memory serves me right, haven't talked to each other since 2019, since that famous picture of Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel and them sitting at that ceasefire agreement back in 2019. So that's one of the biggest things for me. I will say this, look, and I'm one of those folks that will give the president credit when he does something. When he does it, I will give him credit. I can't speak for other pundits out there on television. I'll give him credit. I'll piggyback on what Tony said. This could be one of the biggest peace deals. He should be championing this if this does come to fruition. But I hate what he said today on Fox News earlier this morning with some of my old colleagues there on the morning show with Brian Kilmeade and them, talking about Ukraine taking on a country like Russia. In 2022, February of 2022, Russia invaded a sovereign country in Ukraine. In December of 2019, there was a peace agreement already and ceasefire in place with security assurances between Russia and Ukraine in that famous photo that now exists for everyone to go research. In 2022, 3 years later, Putin reneged on all of that. Whether he feels that NATO is infringing upon his right to reunify the Soviet Union, that's of no consequence right now. That's not what I'm talking about. He invaded a sovereign country. The president of the United States needs to focus on that, but I will give him total credit because, like I said, and like Tony said, what emerged from those conversations yesterday was that we could have both of these leaders in Putin and Zelensky talking to one another, and then a trilateral meeting where Trump will obviously be the third party within that meeting, and we could potentially get security assurances, which Caroline Levitt was asked today in the White House press briefing. How do you make sure that this goes beyond 2025, 2026, and beyond Trump's presidency into a future administration? And those are things that we're gonna need to hear answers to, Don, for sure.
Okay, so we'll get to security guarantees a little bit later in this conversation. I want to dwell a little bit. I just want to dwell a little bit on Mike's point of giving credit where credit is due. I think it's important. So please give us your comments, to the scope of this meeting, right, with Trump, Zelensky, and so many top European leaders gathered around the same table at the White House.
So I want to point out two things. First of all, I think Mike is, again, very accurate when he says that he praises where praise is due and he criticizes where criticism is due. That speaks to his, again, his value morally as a broadcaster. He is very correct, and he always tries to be, from what I can see, very fair on that. So regarding the 2 points that he made and then what you referenced on, and during the Biden years, we were told that Trump had diminished the U.S. on the world stage, that we had actually made the U.S. appear weak, and that actually everything was going to be wonderful and amazing. And it was catastrophic foreign failure, tantamount to the Obama administration before Trump won. And we saw this again. The 2019 ceasefire, which was signed, was supposed to be the French and the Brits, at the prompting of the United States, backing up Ukrainian security guarantees. And then Russia invaded, and we saw the Brits and the French do what they're famous for doing: nothing. And this is something that I think the Trump administration this time around is making sure that we can actually see security guarantees in a stopgap measure, keeping the Brits and the French stationed troops like we have in South Korea to prevent Russia from getting a little antsy, because it would be dead Brits and Frenchmen on the line instead of just soft-handed European guarantees with a Toblerone. So I'm really hoping that, at least as far as the Trump administration is moving forward this time, that you're seeing a lot of really harsh economic action and leverage, which says, if you don't want to be betrayed on the world economy, then fine, stay at war forever. I don't care. And that seems to be Trump's methodology, whether he's dealing with India and Pakistan or the Congo or Rwanda or any of the nations. Again, 6 different ceasefires or peace agreements in the last couple of months. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And again, the self-efficacy of Trump being able to come out and say, or the self-deprecacy, excuse me, of, look, I thought it was going to be easier to negotiate the end to this, and it wasn't. Now we're out here doing the work. I'm really pleasantly surprised and cautiously optimistic, and that's a very dangerous feeling.
All right, so we have a return of Tony's impression of President Trump. But Mike, can I get your comments to other parts of his comments over there? You know, the White House also reiterating this point earlier in the day in that press conference with Caroline Leavitt. Does this meeting underscore a show of U.S. leadership in the world stage?
Well, first off, it's a fantastic impression. A lot of people say Tony is phenomenal. No, but you know, look, you know, I've come around to this, Don. I'll be honest, as I've spoken with not only former Obama State Department employees, I've spoken to military personnel that have kind of changed my opinion on this. And the real stance is this, right? I've always mentioned, with a new administration comes in, there's a tweak in the foreign policy. There's a tweak in the immigration policy. They don't run on it during the campaign cycle because it's tougher to implement once they get into office. Mm-hmm. But now that once they're in office, you see how it's implemented. When they first came into office, Rich Ganell did an interview, I forget with what podcast or wherever it was, and he said, we're going to talk to Russia. Marco Rubio's second trip, I believe it was, after going to the countries in Central America, was really going to Saudi Arabia to meet with Sergei Lavrov. Like, it's a different approach, right? And Putin, even, I don't want to give Putin any credit, but Putin even said this in his presser through the Russian translation, which is, we never spoke to the previous administration. It's good to see that we actually are talking again. And I've come around to this point, Don, that you do need to speak to the adversary. Unfortunately, he is the president of Russia. Obviously, we know about the things that he has done, the political opponents he's had killed. Navalny, Yevgeny Prigozhin was alive just a year ago. Now he's no longer with us. Like, we know of those things that Vladimir Putin has done with respect to Russia. But unfortunately, he is the president of Russia. And Trump has taken it upon himself to first meet with Ukrainian counterparts, and then he met with Russia, and now he's meeting with Ukraine again, and he's trying to organize this. I was very staunch on, I wouldn't do any of this, but again, I'm not a military, I'm not a foreign affairs expert, I'm not a State Department former official or anything like that, but I do think there's something in this with respect to negotiating with both sides. Now, unlike a seesaw, or like a seesaw, I should say, there aren't two sides to this. One invaded the other country. And we have to make sure that we understand that. The European allies understand that everyone understands that Vladimir Putin's goal has always been, and he has said this is not Mike Leon saying it because I don't speak Russian. He has always said this. He wants to reunify the Soviet Union. It's been one of his goals. So if he wants to do that, the first natural invasion was of Ukraine. And where would it stop? Where would it end from there? That's always been the fear of the European countries. That's been the fear of people that you talk to that cover geopolitics, especially that part of the world. I think President Trump, to Tony's point, is saying, look, we don't want to be in the business of war. We don't want to send ground troops, which I totally agree with. We don't want to be the world's supercop, which I totally agree with. That costs money. That costs U.S. lives a lot of the time. So if we want to get out of that business, we need to negotiate peace, regardless of one person being the dictator and the aggressor in all of this, and the other country being the sovereign country that was invaded. So I've come around to this positioning that we do need to negotiate with this. And like I said, I will give credit if he negotiates this. Forget about some of these other conflicts and some that were little lesser known. Russia, Ukraine, and the war in the Middle East and what's happening in Gaza were the two biggest things that were talked about during the campaign cycle. If President Trump were to solve one or both with resolution and an end to innocent civilians being killed in this and the mass casualties that have happened, I will be the first person to hop on this network or any other network for that matter and give him credit. Other people won't do that. I will.
Okay, Tony, a lot to react there. One point I have is in terms of a security guarantee, how could this deal be different from the Budapest Memorandum in the 90s, right, in which the US, UK, and Russia gave security assurances to Ukraine, and then we remember Russia then annexed Crimea in 2014, and then again in 2022, it denied violating the memorandum, characterizing it as security, characterizing those security assurances as sort of a political statement rather than a binding treaty. So your thoughts?
Well, the answer to that is rather simple. It's actually European boots on the ground. So Europe has the desire not to see the Soviet Union reunified. It means that French, British, most likely German troops, or at the very least Dutch troops, are placed in the region in the same way that the United States maintains the border of South Korea. I think this is what we see in the same way with Taiwan. Your economic and military interests in the region demand that you pony up. Soft words and diplomatic, kind Hallmark cards do not actually maintain a border. They do not. Telling people do not cross this border doesn't keep people across the border. A wall and force does. That is a reality of humanity. We can pretend that Sesame Street governs the world. It does not. So there are going to have to be European boots on the ground. But I think this also goes to the president's kind of rationale and communication here, and all the way back to a point that Mike made about a clip from President Trump earlier this morning on Fox News when he was talking about Ukraine not being able to take on Russia alone. So not having heard the entirety of that clip, if the president was just characterizing Ukraine in general as having started the war or being just as guilty as Russia, that would be factually incorrect. However, Zelensky has shown a feet dragging, understandably so, given that it was his country's territory that was taken, in opposition to peace talks. And the point that I believe, again, I haven't seen the full clip, but if Trump was making the point that Russia is not a foe that Ukraine can take on alone, that's true. Ukraine can't take on Russia alone. And so therefore, there do in fact need to be some giving and taking from the Europeans, from the United States, in exchange for certain security guarantees, both in property and in lives. This is, again, an unfortunate political reality that if you're going to keep the Soviet Union from rising again, there have to be sacrifices that are made. Again, I don't think that a sovereign country's borders should be invaded by the power-hungry dictator and quasi-fascist of Russia. Yet in this particular instance, to pretend that Donald Trump can go in and say, well, Russia, you're very, very bad. Well, okay, then Putin will just simply not come to the table. He doesn't mind if another 2 million Russians die in the meat grinder. That's every Russian leader for the last 2 centuries. So he has to play the impartial moderator, despite that there will be a little bit of pearl clutching in the meantime, even if he's doing it kind of tongue in cheek.
So, Mike, how far away do you think we are from actually achieving peace and an end to the war?
Well, Don and Tony said a lot as well about this. Like, it's so complex. It's so hard. Like the president of the United States, and just to quickly clarify for Tony, because the way he was saying it was the former, how you say that, not the latter. He was saying you can't take on an opponent of that size, almost insinuating that they had something to do with the start of this war. But I'll let you listen to the comments, and then you can react, obviously, on your own. But this is part of the complexities of this, right? Like, Marco Rubio in 2022, not Mike Leon, a different Cuban man, Marco Rubio said, you don't negotiate with Vladimir Putin because you can't trust him, right? So therein lies part of the problem. How do we trust somebody, to your point, Don, different times has done different things that have infringed upon another sovereign country? If you look up in a thesaurus what the word annexation, similar words, that means seizure, that means invasion. those are things that Vladimir Putin did under 2 different administrations, both Democratic-led, right? So the problem with all of this is that Trump doesn't want any more wars. He campaigned on no new wars. And like I said, I've come around to this, Don, because if we're taking it at face value, as Donald Trump has always maintained, that, this is what I want to do. Stop asking this person, you come to me, right? Well, if we're coming to him and he says he wants to negotiate peace in the region, how do we have security assurances? Because they've been broken on several different occasions by the dictator, aka the Russian president. So how do we negotiate that? It's for people that are way smarter than the 3 of us to negotiate that. But I think, to Tony's point, it does start with European troops on the ground. I think there has to be some concession of that. The realities of the war right now, secession of land by Ukraine into some of the parts of eastern Ukraine that have already been Russian controlled. It sounds terrible. It does sound terrible. It is terrible because they were invaded. But unfortunately, if we do want the conflict to end, these are things that Steve Witkoff and the delegation that President Trump has assigned to do this work is trying to negotiate right now. This is why it's so complex, Don, because again, there are different people that think that, no, Ukraine with its dance with NATO and stuff like that, and NATO, kind of infringing upon Russia, that they were within their right to do this. That's not the case. It's just not. I'm not a historian, but that's not the case. We have to treat things the way they are, and that's why this is so complex and so hard. But like I said, I will give the president credit. A, meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska. B, obviously having this semi-summit here in the U.S. with the Ukrainian president and obviously the other leaders involved in this. And C, if he gets this trilateral meeting on the books and we do get everlasting peace or some type of agreement that is not broken in perpetuity, incredible. It would be incredible stuff from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
All right, Tony, we're just about out of time. You can have the final thought here. Yesterday, President Trump on social media wrote along the lines that Zelensky has the ability to end the war immediately if he wanted to. Something along those lines. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, that is true. If Zelensky gives in to Russian demands, that's certainly possible. I don't think that's the goal and the benefit, but that is Trump saying that is one of the ends here. You have a high school team going up against the LA Lakers. And no matter how much you really want the high school team to win, they're not going to do it. So either you broker a tie, you broker a stand down, which I don't want to negotiate with them either. But unfortunately, Russia has a large army and a large tactical arsenal that they're just crazy enough to use if things get bad enough. So you do have to play this a little more carefully than when you're in our nation's nobility class in the Senate and you can say loud things very angrily because it gives you camera time.
All right, great conversation again today. Thank you very much, you both, Mike, Tony.
Good to see you guys.